Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have journalist Vicky Ward with us today. We'll chat with Vicky in just a moment, but first, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So Vicky Ward is a #1 New York Times bestselling author, podcaster, documentary host and producer, former CNN senior reporter, magazine editor at large, entrepreneur, and visiting fellow at the University of Oxford. She uses multimedia to deliver investigative reporting with a specialty in power, money, and corruption in the United States and abroad. She is also the author of the best-selling Substack newsletter Vicky Ward Investigates. Her most recent book about the 2022 killing of 4 University of Idaho students, which she co-wrote with best-selling novelist James Patterson, is The Idaho Four, An American Tragedy. It was published in July and became an instant #1 New York Times bestseller. Vicky, welcome into the back room.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start off by talking about your latest book, which is called The Idaho Four, An American Tragedy. This came out in July. You wrote this book with James Patterson, great partner to write a book with. Congrats on its huge success. Tell us about the book and what moved you to write about this particular story.
Yeah, so no, thanks, Andy. I mean, I'm very happy that this book has done so well, chiefly because the 4 victims' families, I think, are very happy with the book, and this is their legacy in a way. So of all the books I've ever written, this is the one I'm the most proud of and the most glad of its great success. I was moved to write it because I have 2 22-year-old twin sons who are the exact same age, and they were both in college when the murders happened in the little town of Moscow in Idaho. I'd never heard of Moscow in Idaho. I saw the pictures of this, really cute, small American town covered in snow in Thanksgiving of 2022 when the murders happened. And, when my own kids came home for the holidays, I kept wondering, well, what are those 4 victims' families going through at this time? And then, and like everybody, I mean, I think because the murders happened at Thanksgiving and there was a then 6-week investigation until they made an arrest right around New Year's Eve, it sort of meant that this particular tragedy, I think, was very visible. It was on the news all the time. And then when they finally arrested Brian Koberger, you had another young college student, another male in his 20s, obviously arrested the other side of the country in Pennsylvania, which is much closer to where I live in New York. And, I think something about all this really spoke to me. And as the mother of sons who, like most people their age, have spent a lot of their formative years online, I sort of, it felt personal. Ethan Chapin, the only young man to have been murdered, was a triplet. And I think that Stacy Chapin, his mother, and I, formed a bond right at the beginning because of both having sort of multiples at the same age. And I also think that Jim and I, right from the beginning, the other thing that really drew us in was the town of Moscow. I mean, I think the book, yes, is the story, obviously, of this the tragic murders and what happened, and exploring the motives as to the why. But it's also the story of a small town that is absolutely ripped apart. And I think the book gets into the fact that the people of Moscow were very proud of the fact, ordinarily, that everybody knows everybody. But for those 6 nightmarish weeks when nobody knew who had done this, that tight-knit community turned into something toxic. When the friend turned on friend or neighbor suspected neighbor. And the book gets into the fact that there were tensions in the town before the murders happened between this very conservative church, which has its own community there, its own school, its own bookstores, its own restaurants, and its stated mission is to evangelize the town. And there had been tensions between the church and police and other townsfolk during COVID. And the book sort of does get into how when the murders happened, those tensions completely exploded. I think it's also the story of the sort of dark forces of the internet in every way. I mean, one of the things that I was really struck by was how the friends, the Maddie, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan, these were not young people who thought about having private social media accounts, and nor did any of their friends. The ultimate dream, particularly for the three female victims, would have been to become influencers. And I think the book, I chronicle the lives of a couple of their really close friends who were going through obviously incredible trauma. Their best friends had been murdered. They didn't know by whom. They didn't know if this person was coming for them next. And in the middle of all of this, these kids get trolled. And they start to very quickly see the dark side of the internet. And on another level, you also see the really pernicious influence of the online community when the police actually do what they've been trained to do, which is to say nothing when the murders happened, right? So they protect the investigation in order then to one day protect a trial if it had happened. I mean, this is what they're trained to do, to say as little as possible to the public. They don't want to tip off whoever did this. But it turns out in the modern world we live in, there's a real problem with that, because into the void come all the online true crime maniacs, and they point fingers at all sorts of people. And the police then ended up spending a huge amount of time that they didn't really have, having to publicly clear people who'd got nothing to do with it. But there were people in Moscow whose livelihoods were nearly ruined because of this. There was a college professor who had to get security and had to wind up, filing a defamation suit. And the other thing that was really striking, I had no idea until I researched this book, how little rights victims' families have. And so the families were sitting there really not knowing the details of what had happened to their children from the police and from the prosecutors. And so they then were vulnerable to what was being said online, because it was, that you would in a situation like that. They were clutching at every straw that they could. So I think that there are many, the book is a bigger and broader book than simply the story of a horrific mass homicide.
Right. It's interesting. There are so many stories like this. There are so many crimes. I have murder in my family. My wife was murdered 20 years ago. And I understand what families go through, and especially in those first harrowing moments. But this story, this crime, really hit America hard. It really seemed to strike a national nerve.
Yes. Well, I think there was that photograph that's on the cover of the book. You see it behind me, the photograph that was taken of the housemates. the day before, it was a football game day weekend at the University of Idaho, and they all posed together on a veranda, which would have been, just feet away from the house that they all lived in. And what's so striking about it is that they're attractive, yes, but they're so normal.
Yep.
I mean, that's what spoke to me. They could be my kids. They could be everybody's kids. And, as a parent of two kids who were both then in college, I mean, it's absolutely, I think, your worst nightmare. You send your kids away for what should be the best time of their life, their opportunity to test things, spread their wings, the last step of their life before they're really on their own. And the idea of murder is horrendous. The idea of being murdered in your bed in the middle of the night. I mean, I think there's just so many things that are so, I think they spark something visceral in all of us.
Mm-hmm. I think you're so right about the cover of your book. I had made a documentary with HBO about my ordeal and my wife's murder. And the opening scene from the film is the Halloween party we had the day before. And my opening line in the film is, every horrible day in history has a much happier day before. And and that's why I think you're right about your cover. It's when you see people, even like the day before, what their life was, how they looked, how happy they were. It's almost impossible to try to reconcile what then happens the next day,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think that what the book also really tried, and this is obviously where Jim's influence is so meaningful as the masterful sort of storyteller that he is. And obviously he primarily writes fiction, and so we did have a lot of conversations at the beginning, and he was very clear to me that I was in some ways to leave my journalistic training at the door. He didn't mean by that go away, make it up, not at all. And the book has 40,000 words of footnotes online. I'm very proud of all that. But what he did mean was, he said, Vicky, we have to feel the pain, and we have to feel like we're there. And the reader has to understand what it's like when something like this happens. And that's why, when the murders happen in the book, we move, there's a chapter, it's the local journalist, his reaction, the police chief, his reaction, the friends, their reaction, the dean of the university. There's a sort of kaleidoscope that moves around, and you get the sense of really all the different perspectives and how just devastating and shocked they all were. And they couldn't believe that something like that had happened in a town which, they had thought by and large was so incredibly safe.
Mm-hmm. When readers finish the last page of this book, what do you hope they walk away with?
Well, I hope, we end it with Maddie, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan, and it is called the Idaho Four. So I hope that they remember the four kids, and because at the end of the day, that's the point. And I hope their families, who are very different, right, in their different ways. I mean, by the way, I have written a new ending for the paperback, because obviously we finished the book, and fortunately Little Brown, the publisher, was very nimble, so I could let go of it very late in, I think, early May, and they were able to quickly go to the printers. But obviously in that window between May and our publishing date of July the 14th, Brian Koberger suddenly, to everybody's surprise, pleaded guilty.
Yeah.
So there was, we were assuming that we were going to be the book that we were going to tell people you have to read before you get to a trial. And now we suddenly realized we were likely to just be, this is the only account you're going to get. But we have written now a new section that brings us up to date with where we are in history. And the final section, not to want to get, is I think focuses on the journey, and it has been an extraordinary journey, of Kaylee Gonzalez's older sister, Olivia Gonzalez, who gave an extraordinary victim impact statement in the courtroom at the very end, Brian Kohberger. And so I hope that people remember the Idaho Four and remember the people who were closest to them, because the book is very much a personal story about them too.
Right. For every person who gets killed, there's a family that they've left behind who has to deal with that mess.
Yes, and actually, as the book ends now, it's that final epilogue with the patch of grass and the house where, the patch of grass where the house was once, and sort of a tribute to them. But it ends with Olivia Gonzalez. I think that readers will understand this never, and you obviously know, Annie, this never goes away.
No.
The book is closed now, but for Olivia, this is never going to be done. And there are, she is doggedly pursuing answers. I think she's trying to get laws changed, because I think I do understand completely, Washington State University, where Brian Kohberger was a PhD student, it's clearly emerged that there were red flags at the school. But because of FERPA restrictions, the families have no real idea what those were. And so you come to this very thorny legal question of, should there be a right to privacy when somebody's been murdered? Or should that go out the window? And so I think, you're going to see quite a lot of advocacy from Olivia Gonzalez in particular. But, it's a sad ending. I mean, it's a sad story. But, I don't think, I don't think anybody thinks, now that there's a legal verdict, it's over. It's never over.
No. That is a very important takeaway for your readers to understand, because this is not a book. It's not a story. It's not a podcast. No. It's people's real lives, and you help bring it to the forefront. But like you said, long after the book is closed, their lives still go on. Their grief, their journey through endless grief continues. Congratulations on it again, and wish you a lot of success with that. And thrilled that you got to work with James Patterson. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So let's talk about another major crime scandal in this country, Epstein, which you know a lot about.
Yeah.
You wrote a 2003 Vanity Fair profile of Jeffrey Epstein. This was published before he became embroiled in his sex trafficking scandal. But in researching and writing the story, you had come to learn about Annie and Maria Farmer, two sisters. Tell us who they were back then and what ultimately happened with them in your piece.
Oh, so originally, I was assigned to write about Jeffrey Epstein, believe it or not, because the editor of Vanity Fair at the time, Graydon Carter, thought it would be easy for me. And it was meant to be a story about his money, because he was this enigma in New York. And he lived in famously biggest private townhouse on the Upper East Side, but nobody knew where on earth that his money had come from, who he was, really anything about him. And I had a high-risk pregnancy with my twin sons, and so and Jeffrey Epstein was not somebody who was out and about or visible in New York, and he was never written about. But suddenly, that in the fall of 2002, there was a small item in the gossip section of the New York Post saying that he had flown on his plane Bill Clinton and a bunch of celebrities on a philanthropic mission to Africa. So that was the news peg. And my boss said to me, this should be easy. He lives in New York. You live in New York.
Right.
I always wondered where money came from. Off you go. So, and to give you some idea of how, I knew nothing at the beginning of this. I knew Ghislaine Maxwell socially, not well. She was, but you can hear from my accent where I grew up. I grew up in England, as did she. She's probably 6 years older than me, but I definitely know people who were at Oxford University with her. The British expat world in New York is quite a small world. So she would unlike Jeffrey Epstein, she would pop up at big, parties in New York, and she was, but never with Jeffrey Epstein in tow, or as I recall, anyone really in tow. But she was this glamorous figure, and I never really understood what she actually did professionally. We all knew who her father had been, but she was always, and she clearly had money because she was always dressed in designer clothes very expensively. But she would talk about, flying a Black Hawk helicopter, and she would talk about Bill Clinton and all these other, famous, powerful leaders of countries around the world. So, I mean, it was a head scratcher, but she just seemed to live in a universe that was parallel to everybody else's, and it sounded so much more glamorous. I didn't know about her relationship. I think I may have known she knew Jeffrey Epstein, but I had no idea. I began reporting this piece, and I got hold of Epstein on the phone, and he was very clear he didn't want this to happen. And I said, well, it's going to happen. It's going to happen anyway, whether you want it to or not. And, he thought, I think this was a huge joke. And he said, okay, well, in that case, this is going to be like a game of chess. You be white, you get the first move. And very quickly, I realized that, he was really going to manipulate things behind the scenes, because I got a phone call. It was the day of landlines. I got a phone call from a guy called James Kane, who was then the CEO of Bear Stearns, which was a major investment bank. I hadn't actually phoned everyone called him Jimmy Kane. So it's unheard of for a journalist to get called by the CEO of an investment bank unsolicited. And he comes on the phone and he says, are you free this afternoon? Could you swing by? Come see me in my office. And I remember it because I was pregnant, and I remember sitting for hours, it was uncomfortable. As he talked on and on and on. He clearly was on a charm offensive, but he wanted to tell me how great a client Jeffrey Epstein was, and what a great colleague he'd been when he'd worked there. And Jimmy Kane wanted to take me on a tour of the new headquarters of Bear Stearns. That was just really odd, really odd. And the next thing that was really odd that happened was I actually ran into Ghislaine, and I said, oh, I'm doing this piece, by the way, about Jeffrey Epstein. I know you know him. It's about his money. And she started to cry. Well, again, that was very odd. And very quickly, I then heard that not only was there something very strange about his financial and professional background, there were lots of things that didn't add up. He hadn't graduated from college. He claimed to be making money for billionaires, but there was no footprint of him in the markets. There were rumors that he'd been fired or left Bear Stearns in strange circumstances. There were all sorts of things. But then I started to hear that there was something dark around his relationship with women, and that there were parties at his house. There were, lots of models. I mean, that on the face of it isn't, it's not illegal.
Right.
But I began to get a whiff of something, and somebody said to me, you should speak to Maria Farmer, who was an artist who then had a studio in New Jersey. So I phoned her up, and she actually came to my house in New York at the time. And I remember we sat in our living room, and she told me the story of how when she was in her 20s, she had worked for Jeffrey Epstein as a sort of art advisor, art consultant, and how she had introduced her Annie Farmer, then her younger sister, who was then only 16 years old and in high school, but clearly very smart, wanting to go to an Ivy League college, and how Jeffrey and Ghislaine had been very keen to meet her, and she'd been flown in for this weekend, and it had, Jeffrey Epstein had sent a limo to the airport. And that's where the story started to get weird. And Maria told me that, they'd gone to the movies, and that she was worried that Jeffrey was holding Annie Farmer's, her sister's, hand, and sort of thought maybe, that can't be right. And that Annie Farmer and then Annie had been asked by both Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein to go to stay with them for a weekend in New Mexico. Maria didn't go, but Ghislaine Maxwell had phoned the farmer's mother and assured her that, she would be there. And the point of the weekend was was for them, they said, to get to know Annie better, so that then they were going to fund a trip abroad for her, which she needed to beef up her resume for her application to Penn. So you can see, very, if you were 16 years old and ambitious, you'd want to do it.
Part of the grooming.
Yeah. And Maria Farmer told me that she later found out, and this was actually one of the really difficult thing for Maria, because Annie Farmer kept it from her because she didn't want to jeopardize her older sister's job. That weekend turned into a nightmare for Annie Farmer, that Ghislaine Maxwell gave her a topless massage, made her very uncomfortable, and she thought that Jeffrey might have been looking. And the next morning, Jeffrey climbed into bed with her. I mean, she was in her pajamas and sort of pressed up against her, and she went home, and I think she just kept it all to herself. But a few months later, Maria Farmer had her own horrendous experience with both Jeffrey and Ghislaine. She was painting up in Ohio, where Jeffrey Epstein had a house on the estate of Leslie Wexner, who was the billionaire, who was the sort of chief client at that point in time. And Maria Farmer told me that one night while she was there, they had both sexually abused her, and she'd been so frightened that she had sort of run out into the middle of the night and walked a very long way to wait for her father to drive all the way from, I think, Kentucky or somewhere to come and pick her up. And she told me that she'd gone to the police and she'd gone to the FBI, and nobody had done anything about all of this. So obviously, then I having talked to her, we stayed in touch. It took me some time, because Annie Farmer was at that time at Penn. And so ultimately I also connected with Annie, who told me her story. And then I spoke to their mum, and I spoke to other people, including the artist Eric Fischel, who'd been a mentor of Maria's, who all these people totally remembered the farmers telling them about this at the time in real time. And meanwhile, I was also reporting on all the business stuff, and I did discover that Jeffrey Epstein's real mentor was a guy who was sitting in jail outside of Boston, a guy called Steve Hoffenberg, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison for committing the biggest Ponzi scheme in American history prior to Bernie Madoff. And so I went. So this story, by the way, was getting much different from what
what you intended.
Envisaged. So, I go off to visit Steve Hoffenberg in prison, and he, and the problem obviously is when you have a convicted felon telling you stuff, is you can never, you have to be able to have documentation if they allege anything, because it's meaningless given they're
not the most credible witnesses.
Exactly. So Hoffenberg had a lot to say about Jeffrey Epstein being a con artist and a sort of someone who ripped off his wealthy clients, knowing that they would be too embarrassed to go to the authorities. And so I then realized I needed to find a paper trail to back up what he was saying, which then entailed going through SEC records, by now I was so pregnant that I wasn't allowed to bend over. So I took an assistant with me at Vanity Fair. We went to Philadelphia to the warehouse of a law firm to go through their archives, and we were very lucky. We did find a bunch of very helpful depositions that indeed confirmed that Jeffrey Epstein had been kicked out of Bear Stearns amongst an SEC investigation into insider trading, and all sorts of things had been going on. So that was really helpful. So, but we then get to, by this point, Jeffrey Epstein is phoning me every day wanting to know what I've got. And because he's begun to realize, initially he gave me a list of people, business guys, Nobel Prize winning academics, who all said very nice things about him, that all talked about his brain. And I guess I stopped calling anyone on his list because I was, now I had my own list. And I think he sensed something was up. So he began to issue these threats to me. If I don't like this piece, I'm going to have a witch doctor place a curse on your unborn children. And then he would say, and that's off the record. And he would also say I'm going to have your husband fired. And, sometimes stupid thing, I'm going to make sure your kids never get into school in New York. And I know all the doctors in New York, I know where you're going to be giving. But these are not things you really want to hear when you're pregnant. And back then, we had no idea who this guy was. I phoned the lawyers. I'm saying, he's saying all these things. He's then telling me that they're off the record. I don't know, I don't know if he's a member. We wondered if he was part of the mob at one point because Leslie Wexner was the owner of Victoria's Secret. And, there was, retail and mob have, the clothing industry, garment industry in New York have sometimes gone, man, we were like, who is this guy? And is he serious? Could he deliver on this? And the witch doctor thing was so creepy. And so the lawyers said, you got to tape him, because we just had no idea what we were up against. And then, the way certainly I used to proceed, and I think was common practice, particularly with an investigative piece like this, is you would write the draft knowing then that the lawyers would go through it with the fact checkers and then help me work on questions to give to him. And obviously the questions about sort of the murky finances were ones he wouldn't like, but the questions about the farmers, he was really not going to like.
Right.
And so I waited till, the piece was in, I'd written it, the lawyers helped me with the questions. We had fax, one of a fact checker faxed a list of questions about the farmers to Ghislaine as well. And he went with the business stuff. He pretended to think it was. He said, "Oh, it's so boring." He wasn't pleased, but he didn't go off the deep end. And in hindsight, obviously, what one can understand why, because what he was really concerned about was that he kept saying, "So what have you got on the girls? What have you got on girls?" And other than the farmers, I wish I didn't know of Virginia Roberts Giuffre's existence, because all of 2002, when I'm doing this, and it's the exact same time period that she leaves. She gets on a plane to Thailand and never comes back. And it's also the time that a young woman called Jennifer arose, who I now know, I got to know well over 20 years later. It was when she was in high school and she was being abused and raped by Jeffrey Epstein. I wish, I didn't have any of the horrific stories we now know all about, but I did have the farmers. And so he went off the deep end, as did Ghislaine Maxwell. And he went on an offensive, faxing over pages of documents that he said refuted their allegations, because they sort of showed thank you letters to him from and but nonetheless, I thought we had this piece pretty rock solid, but he had the last word on this. He out-manipulated me, because on December the 4th, I got an email from a fact checker saying, Jeffrey Epstein is here in the offices, in Graydon's office. I mean, it's not normal for the subject of a profile to walk in and sit down with the editor of the magazine. I mean, it's not normal at all. And I was really taken aback. But I thought, well, okay, he can do his worst. I did know that we needed from him, Vanity Fair at the time, this is, going back many years ago, it wasn't online. It was, it was a physical magazine, and the photo, it was as well known and prided itself on its photography as much as its editorial content. So I did know that Graydon Carter, the editor, considered it a problem that we didn't have photographs from Jeffrey Epstein. And he knew that was his leverage, actually. So, naively, I still thought all will be well. Well, all wasn't well, because at the 11th hour, the piece, so we didn't finally let go of the piece until January, the way it were, even though it's in the March 2003 issue. What that actually meant was it appeared on newsstands in early February, so we didn't let go of it till January. And in the final, they called them galley, that went around, there was no mention of the Farmer Sisters. And that was devastating, because I had put their allegations to Jeffrey and Ghislaine, so they were now exposed. And at the time, I think, I remember speaking to Maria, and she said, maybe it's for the best, but it wasn't. It wasn't at all. And then I went, into labor, way too soon. And so 2 days before the piece was actually going to hit the newsstands. And so given all the conversations I'd had with Jeffrey Epstein by that point, my husband and I were actually genuinely worried that we now had two tiny babies. One was 2 pounds, one was 3 pounds, and that, that he would try to harm them. Mm. So we asked for help at the hospital. I mean, it was a really, really stressful time. And I never thought, I mean, to be honest, I hoped I'd never hear about Jeffrey Epstein ever again. But I can't remember how many months or a year, I then did get a call from the FBI. So which was the first inkling to me that something was going on. I mean, I never had a call from the FBI before. I wasn't sure what to do. I went to Graydon Carter, he didn't want to know. And then one of my colleagues, John Connolly, former NYPD cop, was close to some of the Palm Beach police. So around 2005, 2006, he said to me, I'm hearing there's stuff going on down there. Yeah. I'm going to go. And he got shut down by Graydon Carter. I mean, ultimately, John Connolly, sadly, is dead now, back in 2016, did publish with James Patterson, Filthy Rich. Mm-hmm. So he was able to tell that story, but 10 years later than he would have liked. And and I mean, now the story comes more probably into what everybody knows. I mean, that there was a FBI investigation into Jeffrey Epstein, and obviously he managed to pervert justice. I mean, he managed to get rid of the federal charges and cop a plea to state charges and serve a very cushy sentence. And he was able to whitewash to his powerful, wealthy friends around the world what had happened. And he told this story that a lot of people believed, that there had been some young woman who'd lied about her age. Mm-hmm. And people believed this, which is why when he came out of jail, you saw Bill Gates and all these famous, leaders of countries, tech leaders, business leaders, even JP Morgan continuing to bank him. I mean, it goes on and on and on until finally in 2000, until the cultural climate changes, Me Too begins. Julie Brown at the Miami Herald really goes and gets the victims on the record. Mm-hmm. And there's I think that there's a sea change in Congress, finally. Yeah. And people forget it was bipartisan. Ben Sass, then the senator for Nebraska, was really vocal in calling for something to be done. But obviously, I mean, this took years. So
the story about the Farmer sisters was killed. Was there just not enough evidence, or were you...
we had it. It's,
like just a tip-off to the FBI. Like, was that not... Were you not able to...
So I got called... So we couldn't find... I did look at the time for the police records. And I remember they were not helpful, and there was none. So that I mean, it would have been great to have found that. And years later, the New York Times did find a record of Maria's complaint to them.
So there were complaints filed?
She filed a complaint with the police, but I went looking for it, and police never... They were very unhelpful, actually. I think that... No, we had, by any standard, but particularly the standard that then sort of evolved during Me Too, which is you need to have multiple contemporaneous I had that. I think I know Graydon Carter said to me, Jeffrey is sensitive about the girls. Well, of course he was. I think, in hindsight, I do remember Graydon Carter saying to me, I believe him. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt. And back then, it was a lot of editors hated stories about sexual abuse, sexual. I mean, it was a different time. Someone pointed out to me recently, David Enrich, actually, at the New York Times, who just did a fabulous deep dive sort of narrative about JP Morgan's role in banking Epstein, said to me, that the other thing that, he has always felt is that, Vanity Fair was possibly not the right vehicle to do a real hard-hitting investigation into somebody's sex crimes. And obviously, in hindsight, that's probably true. I mean, that wasn't what the piece was supposed to be about at the beginning. But having said that, I still stand by my reporting, and I stand by that what happened was wrong, really wrong.
Mm-hmm. It's blowing my mind listening to you, because there are so many parallels between the way Epstein was shielded for so many years, starting around that time, obviously, to the way he's still being shielded, the way these files are being shielded, the way whatever list, whether it's a tangible black book or just someone's knowledge of who his co-sex traffickers are. It's maddening to see that other rich, powerful, influential men are still holding his water.
Right.
Do you think we're ever going to get to the bottom of this case? Do you think people will ultimately be held accountable? Are we ever going to see those files?
Well, so I think, I think that there is a drumbeat for this, right, amongst Trump's supporters, right, well as the left, and so I would hope that just to be clear, the Epstein files are the FBI documents of discovery that they have. So, I've never thought, from all the years of reporting on this story, that there's not a list of names, but what you will have in the FBI files are interviews, 302s, women talking about who they met when they were around Epstein. There's a lot
who
of
raped
that.
them. I mean, that press conference outside the Capitol, the survivor said, "We have a list. We know."
Right.
Who
And
raped
that
us.
they may end up taking matters into their own hands. I mean, let's not forget Virginia Giuffre has a memoir coming out posthumously.
Yeah, next month.
And I'm led to believe that there are going to be some big names in it. I think I did a round table taping for an NPR show that hasn't come out yet, with Tara Palmieri, who was very close to Virginia, and David Enrich, and Tara's producer, Eric. And she has more, I think, inside knowledge of this. I think that there are names that are going to shock people, but I also think that some of the names, they may be dead now. I think that the money trail is just as important, because if Jeffrey Epstein hadn't been shielded by money, none of this would have happened.
Sure.
And
what was it? Wasn't it this week we learned, or last week, J.P. Morgan knew what was going down with Jeffrey Epstein. They were bringing him into the building and taking his money.
Sure.
They didn't care.
100%. Yeah. No, I mean, that was the David Enrich brilliant piece. Yes. They were, because money talks. And because, because he was bringing in other clients, he was bringing in Leon Black. I found that, I think there's a question right there. I mean, Leon Black is one of the richest men in America. Why did JP Morgan need Jeffrey Epstein to get to him? I mean, right there, that doesn't make sense. Alex, as we speak today, I mean, Alex Acosta, I think, has been into Congress today, this morning. Right. I mean, I mean, look, I am hopeful now that there is, on both sides of the aisle, there is a push. I hope that we can get to some of the answers, and the people who need to be held to account get held to account. But you're right. I mean, the amount of kind of abuse of the system by powerful people that's going on is extraordinary.
Yeah, and topping that is that the levers of government and the levers of law enforcement are in the hands of people who right now may be motivated not to have that accountability.
Right. Although I will tell you this, I spoke to Brad Edwards, or we spoke on text not so long ago, a couple of weeks ago, because I'm surprised by Trump's digging in on this, because I have not come across a survivor, but this doesn't mean they don't exist. I have not heard of Trump being one of the men, I've never heard Trump's name as somebody that Jeffrey Epstein pimped anyone out to. It would seem that Trump ultimately did break with Jeffrey Epstein. He did ultimately, I think there are records documenting that he chucked him out of Mar-a-Lago. So I was really surprised about his reaction to the victims, the survivors' press conference on Capitol Hill. And interestingly, so was Brad Edwards, the lawyer who has represented more, I think, Epstein survivors than anyone else, because as far as he knows, Trump has historically been very helpful in investigating Jeffrey Epstein. When Brad Edwards, after the sweetheart plea deal in Florida went down, Brad Edwards immediately represented a group of victims and who banded together and filed a class action suit, Crime Victims' Rights Act, because they hadn't been told of the plea deal, which is illegal, it turns out. But Brad Edwards phoned Trump or phoned his lawyer at the time and said, I want to depose him. I want to subpoena him. And said, no, you don't need to subpoena. He'll get on the phone with you at 10 o'clock next week. Trump has been, and Trump was helpful. So it's there are so many twists and turns in this story. And I hope that we are getting closer to unraveling some of them.
Yeah, well, these women are very brave, those who have come forward, and they and every other survivor deserves that. And so I do hope that happens. Vicky, thank you so much for coming on and chatting about this really important story, as well as the one you shared with us up front about the college kids in your book.
Thank you so much for having me.
All righty, take care. This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhinecliff, with additional editing by Maddie Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Langell. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.